Good evening, gang. David Guppel, Thinker Farmer here. It's September 11th, and today I wanted to talk about, really totally unrelated to 9/11 or whatnot. Today I wanted to essentially catch up on a topic that's dear to my heart. It's been on my mind for, at least 6 months, but time's been getting away from me. I haven't been doing a lot of videos, been occupied with other things, or at least not a lot of videos, teaching type videos. So in this video, I'm essentially want to finish a 2-part series I did where I talked about not settling for average, or don't settle for average, part 1 and part 2. It's probably been 10-20 episodes back. And so that's why you see up here as the title, What's Not Average? And then below it you see the unique farmer. And in the 2-part video series that I did on not settling for average, I explained, and you can go back and look at them, that average will get you by today. But if you want to be a successful farmer and you're looking at the next 30 to 40 years, being average and just squeaking by today isn't what's going to make you successful as a farmer, because it's a competitive industry out there. There's a lot of reasons. I'm not going to go into that. You can go back and look at the 2-part series, but there's a lot of reasons why just barely scraping by isn't going to last year after year as a farmer. You're going to have to go ahead and innovate. Some farmers are not innovating today, and that's going to cost them as time moves on. So I put together this list of 8 things. This is by no means an exhaustive list. These are the things that I've personally seen. Some of them I've personally experienced and lived through. These are some things that are what I would call not average. So I kind of listed most of these as a positive and a lesser, not necessarily a negative. So essentially I gave you what I would consider on the left a more unique persona of a farmer. And then on the right, you'll see what I would call more average things that farmers do as a general matter of course. And so let's get started. So first and number 1, some things that are going to distinguish you as a farmer. And I'm going to say it again. What's wrong with average? There's really nothing wrong with average. In some cases, being average is okay, maybe even a little good. But if you're settling for that, don't think you're going to be getting somewhere with your farming career or with your farm business or caring for your land. Settling for average is what keeps a lot of really good people from being really great or exceptional people. So, intentional. This is the first thing I listed. Being an intentional individual as opposed to an intense individual. It's very typical for a lot of farmers and a lot of individuals to be very intense, engaged into a lot of activities, and have a very intense season where they're constantly rushing and pushing. Farming's a busy life, can be a busy lifestyle, and certainly really intense at times. You know, when you're harvesting crops, when you're planting crops, when you're working in a corral with animals, you think about all the different farm tasks. At times it can get very intense and very exciting, and you can get an adrenaline rush, and some people live for that adrenaline rush. And I'm not against all intensity. Sometimes you do what you have to do, but if all you do is be intense, you're settling for average. What you need to look for, if you're going to go the distance, is being intentional. You need to be the individual that has very clearly laid out intentions. He's got a plan, he knows he's got a purpose, and he's working very constructively towards that end. So this has been a big deal in my life. And we've all heard the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So I'm not saying having good intentions is going to fix things, but it's about being a person of intention. If you're doing things just because that's the way you've always done them, and you don't really have a intended purpose or a path behind it, if you've not really asked yourself why you're doing it, you're wasting your time. So Intentional versus intense. I don't want this video to go on long, so I'm probably going to push on through these, and you can think about them more later. Critical thinking versus hard work. Again, hard work is an absolutely fundamental thing to success in anything, but if you stop at saying, well, I put in 80 hours this week, that's all I'm going to do. Well, I'm not saying you needed to put in the 80 hours, but if you're not thinking critically about how you're spending those 80 hours, if you're not thinking about why you're doing those things, how you can improve, how you can do better, going through a constant self-awareness process to see where you can shave time off of tasks, to explore why you're doing the tasks, whether they're the things you really need to do, looking at the ecology. If you're not taking the time to observe the ecology and how it's responding to your management, if you're just working it hard, you're probably shooting yourself in the foot. Third thing, pioneer-minded versus peer-minded. Now, in this case, again, being peer-minded, being aware of what your peers think is not wrong. You should be aware. You live in a community, you should be aware. But if you're more concerned about what everybody else thinks of you than you are about innovating and moving your farm forward, making it profitable, enjoying the lifestyle that you have for yourself, for your family, taking care of the ecology, taking care of business, if you're more concerned, if you're making your purchasing decisions and basing your judgment decisions on how everybody else is doing it, if you say, well, this is what everybody else is doing, so this must be how I need to do it. I know somebody told me when I was in a job interview recently, it was a conventional guy, and I ended up not taking the job. He said, you really need to learn how to artificially inseminate cows and heifers and do all that, because that's what everybody's going to. Doing things, breeding with a bull in the field, that's something of the past. You've got to keep up with what everybody else is doing. He was being peer-minded. He was saying that since that's what everybody else is doing, that must mean what you need to do. Reality is, if you're going to be a unique farmer, you've got to do something different. And the only way you've got any marketing advantage out there is by differentiating yourself. So the idea that you've got to listen to what your peers think and only do what everybody else does and get inside the circle of wagons, it doesn't make any sense. You've got to be pioneer-minded. You've got to trailblaze a path. If you don't start somewhere with experimenting, you're never going to get anywhere. Number 4, appreciating versus depreciating. And this specifically relates to assets, but you could apply it to other things. Are the decisions you're making, are the investments in time and money, etc., are they in things that are going to increase in value over time, or are they in things that are going to depreciate? This can also apply to skill sets. So plenty of really successful farmers like Greg Judy, Joel Salatin, I could go on, Jim Garish, plenty of people have made the point that you don't invest in a lot of heavy metal and machinery. I've been guilty of it. I bought a lot of hay equipment. I sold it. I got rid of the equipment. It's depreciating equipment. It's heavy metal. In order to make that equipment work, you've got to spend tons of hours on tractors, which are also depreciating equipment. A tractor doesn't make a baby. Appreciating means you invest in things that are going to increase in value. Long-term, land will usually appreciate in value. Livestock will appreciate, and livestock is something that is fluid. You can easily sell it. You can move it around. Cows do make babies, and they do generate income, and cows will manage your land for you. That's why Greg Judy makes such a big deal about investing in livestock on the hoof and getting your own herd. That's what no-risk ranching is all about. You're custom grazing and then eventually getting your own stock and doing it on leased land because you can actually cash flow that. And so you're starting with an appreciating asset. The first thing you do is not go out and build a barn that's going to depreciate or equipment. And this applies to skill sets too. I spent a few years as a mechanic, and I don't regret my experience developing mechanical skills and problem-solving skills, but there was no point in me continuing as a career in a mechanic if I wanted to be a regenerative grass farmer, because I'm spending more and more hours and days learning about how to take care of depreciating infrastructure. So be careful how you spend your time for skill sets. If somebody tells you you need to work on tractors for a few years before you be a farmer, I would learn more about that person's paradigm. I'm not saying you don't need to learn how to fix your own equipment, but spending a number of years just focusing on depreciating infrastructure may actually put you behind the curve, not ahead of it. And so you've got to evaluate those decisions and decide. In my case, I love the people I worked with, and I wouldn't trade a day I spent at the mechanic shop. But again, I'm not going to buy lots of tractors, and I'm not going to continue to invest in becoming a mechanical individual, because machines ultimately rust, rot, and depreciate, as Alan Nation would say. So number 5, humble boldness versus proud timidity. Now, this is, I'll just flat out say it. It's the most common thing in the world to find people that are proud, and often those very same people are afraid. Pride and timidity go together. A lot of farmers are too proud to change. A lot of farmers are afraid to change. And the reality is anything that is different from the status quo is threatening, and it scares them. And it also is threatening and humbling for them to think that maybe I can actually do better, even though I've been working hard for years and years. Because you would think, if you've been working at it for 30, 40 years or more, you would think that you couldn't get any better. But reality is, because nature is dynamic, there's always room for improvement. There's always room to manage better. There's always room to improve on your farm, on your soil biology, and everything. You may get to a certain level and think, well, that's it. I'm as good as it gets. There's always a better way. And you don't have to burn yourself out sharpening an already sharp saw. What you do need to look at is alternatives for getting those trees down. So, yeah, humble boldness. The opposite of proud timidity is that you have humility. You recognize that there's a ton of things you don't know. There's areas to improve in you've never seen. And that means you're open to options. At the same time, you're not afraid to try. Your humility doesn't become self-pity or woe is me. It's a boldness that says, I know I don't know a bunch of things, but I'm not afraid to try. I'm going to go out there and give it my best shot. An experimental mind has to have some boldness. It's going to essentially kick the status quo and do things that other people say can't be done. Number 6, long-term, low cost versus short-term or high costs. And this applies to decisions, investments, etc. So if your decisions are always short-term, you're not getting yourself down the road. If your decisions are always high costs, that's not going to work out in terms of building up an extra nest egg of income to do other things that you want to and to have a lifestyle. This is a large problem with conventional agriculture, grain feeding animals, crop farming, conventionally. You always have a short-term result that might be profitable and it might cash flow, but it always comes at a high cost. And so your land's getting poorer and poorer year after year, but your costs stay the same or keep going up. You're cutting yourself off at the knees, which you're going to have to look at, and you may have to do some things in the short term just to get by, but where you're going to have to look at is some longer term decisions. And how can I save some money here? How can I reduce my costs? How am I going to better this land over time? An example for me right now, while I'm home, is I'm spending quite a bit of money and time buying trees and also propagating trees and also picking out strategic sites. I'm spending a lot of time as well just growing annual vegetables, but I'm investing in perennials. And so this would be an example on farm. Let's say you need more shade for your animals. Are you going to go with a short-term decision that's a high cost and go out and buy a really expensive shade mobile that's really slick? Or are you going to go ahead and purchase trees at a low cost or create some hedgerows where you can grow more trees and take a little bit of acreage out of grazing production and grow your own trees or buy in some trees? There will be a very low cost in planting a lot of those trees compared to, and long term, you're going to have a ton of shade and you're not going to have to get a four-wheeler or a tractor in there to move your shade structure. You might have to do a cross-up between the two, but I think you get the picture. You need to look at long-term decisions. A farm, land endures. Land has been here for millennia. It's not going anywhere. If we're going to manage it well, we've got to look at our long-term decisions. We've got to look at low-cost decisions. And the last two, I know the video's gone long, so I'm going to just very briefly say these. You can think about them. Record keeping, and this applies to money, this applies to time. Bill Salatin, Joel Salatin's dad, the actual original person that founded and bought Polyface Farms back in 1961, he was a very studious, meticulous accountant, and he believed that you should be able to get done if you had a full-time job where you worked 5 days a week, you should be able to get the bulk of your work done in 3 days. And he kept meticulous records of his time in 15-minute increments. So even if he only spent 10 to 15 minutes on something, he wrote down how he spent that time, because unless you measure something, you can't improve, because you don't even know where you're at. You don't know. And so on your farm or your ranch, if you're not keeping records of how much time you're spending doing tasks, or the growth of forage that you have on your place, how your management strategies are working, you're ultimately shooting in the dark. So you have to keep records. Number 8, emergency fund. So emergency fund, most people, when you think of a fund, you think of finances. And yes, on a farm or ranch, you need to be keeping some money on hand to deal with essentially tight periods where your cash flow it's tight and you don't have extra money around. You need to have an emergency fund. You need to be keeping a little bit of extra money on hand. I'm amazed how many people in the world would like to farm, but they're living paycheck to paycheck, or they're in debt. If you're already in debt or you're living paycheck to paycheck, I don't know how you expect to make things work on a farm. You're going to have even more bills and things and more decisions to make. So if you're making poor decisions with your off-farm job, how are you going to make them on a farm when you're on your own? But it doesn't just, this emergency fund idea is all about keeping margin in your life. And so it applies not just to having a financial bank account, but also having an emotional bank account. And that means, how do you treat your team members? How do you treat your family and friends, etc.? If you are always pushing and straining on your relationships and you're not creating an emotional bank account so that you can draw on that when you are actually in an emergency, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Anyway, gang, I know the video went long, but there you have it. If you want to be a unique farmer, these are 8 things I would encourage you to look at. And with that, gang, blessings for the journey, and keep it real.